Welcome back to Fox News Reporting. Few of us have the time or expertise to truly understand the complicated math, chemistry, physics, and computer modeling that climatologists use to make the case that global warming is a serious problem, requiring an urgent, immediate response. In the end, we have to trust the scientists, as we do every time we board a plane, spray for pests, or get a flu shot. But what to make of once private emails of leading global warming scientists that revealed talk of employing mathematic tricks to alter data that seemed to contradict their theories, undermining academic journals that published skeptical research papers, and hiding their own scientific dirty laundry? The leak came just weeks before the Copenhagen conference began. But as Eric Shawn explains, to understand their importance, you have to go back to a decade-old story about a hockey stick.
The hockey stick. Not the first instrument you'd think of to make the case for man-made global warming. But over and over in the scientific literature, the term keeps popping up. To be sure, not a hockey stick like this, but like this, a graph, first published in 1998 by Dr. Michael Mann, an expert in the little-known field of paleoclimatology. Mann set out to plot northern hemisphere temperatures over the last 1,000 years. The graph's shape, like a hockey stick, suggests temperatures remained relatively steady for most of those years, before rising sharply in the 20th century. Its inescapable conclusion is something happened beginning about 1900 that caused the Earth to dramatically heat up. But what? Here you have to add in other researchers' findings that carbon dioxide emissions from cars, homes, and factories can trap the sun's heat in the atmosphere. That research, viewed in the context of Mann's hockey stick graph, supported a theory that if humans continued to generate even more CO2, they would heat up the planet so much that polar ice caps would melt, sea levels would rise, heat waves would scorch our planet, and the Earth would become essentially unlivable. Mann's graph made the point so dramatically that it was prominently featured in a publication by the United Nations-sponsored Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, also known as the IPCC.
The hockey stick was everywhere, and in fact still is everywhere.
Patrick Michaels is Senior Fellow in Environmental Studies at the Cato Institute, a libertarian think tank.
If you wanted to say that the current climate was so unusual that terrible things were going to happen in the near future, it was absolutely at the core of it.
It was in 2002 that Mann's graph fatefully caught the eye of Stephen McIntyre, a retired Toronto mining executive who decided he was going to figure out what all this global warming talk was about. McIntyre isn't a scientist, but he was a math scholar, and he has dealt with geologists all his life. He told us he emailed Mann asking for copies of his data.
To my surprise, he wrote back that the data was somewhere, but he'd forgotten where it was. And I thought, this had been on the front page of a UN study. It just seemed inconceivable. The data was not at his right index finger.
Eventually, Mann did provide data from his study, which reconstructed long-ago temperatures not from thermometer readings, which go back less than 300 years, but from indirect evidence, so-called proxy data, studies of ancient ice, ocean coral, and mostly the rings of old-growth trees. Now, every student knows you can tell the age of a tree by counting the rings. For example, this slice of a giant sequoia here at New York's American Museum of Natural History is more than 1,300 years old. Now, paleoclimatologists believe that as a general rule, the wider the rings, the hotter the year. As you'll see later, some say it may not always work out that way. But again, the basic theory is this, that if you properly analyze the rings of carefully selected ancient trees, you can accurately reconstruct a temperature record going back centuries. And that's what Professor Mann did, gathering up the various proxy evidence, designing a complex series of computer programs to run it through, and generating the temperature readings that formed his hockey stick graph.
Were you surprised that scientists were so certain about their conclusions when it's based on the proxy evidence?
Well, if you had really good proxy evidence, you could be fairly definite about things. But I think the problem with the tree ring and ice core evidence over the 1,000-year period was that there is a lot of inconsistency.
Before Mann's hockey stick graph, Patrick Michaels says many climatologists like himself were convinced that the Earth went through a medieval warm period approximately 800 years ago. As this graph in a 1990 IPCC publication indicates, during that time, long before the advent of the internal combustion engine, temperatures were warmer than the present day.
There was a lot of evidence for the medieval warm period. Diverse, independent streams of evidence. And McIntyre was trying to figure out how a result could have come out that was so different than what appeared in this very, very large stream of literature.
I started noticing problems with the data.
Problems with Dr. Mann's data. Odd problems, McIntyre says, like sloppy clerical errors, columns that didn't line up, and repeated figures.
I posted up some comments on an internet chat group, and some professors wrote to me and said, well, you know, we don't know who you are, but you're looking at the data differently than anybody else, and stay with it.
Enter Ross McKittrick, an economist at Canada's University of Guelph, who was also raising questions.
Steve just sent me an email one day. He wanted to show me the work that he was doing on the hockey stick.
McKittrick is now a visiting professor of economics at the University of Buckingham in England.
What was your reaction when you saw his analysis of the hockey stick?
It just needed some work to write it up in a way that it could become accessible to other people.
Over the next 2 years, McIntyre and McKittrick, now working together, analyzed the research Michael Mann used to make the hockey stick graph. They would publish 2 papers. In some, McIntyre says, Mann's data and methodology did not allow him to make the claim that current temperatures are in fact higher than in the medieval warm period, let alone to say that with statistical confidence. Mann, who has not returned our repeated requests for an interview, has claimed their papers contain false and misleading statements. Climate expert Patrick Michaels of the Cato Institute disagrees. He says McIntyre and McKittrick pose a challenge to the settled science that man-made global warming is a serious problem needing immediate and drastic measures to address.
McIntyre and McKittrick had clearly altered the path of science on this issue.
Is there any chance that what you found is wrong?
With regard to the specific criticism of the hockey stick graph, there's no chance that our argument was wrong.
Do you believe there is global warming?
Yes.
And how bad do you think it is?
I don't know whether it's a big problem, a medium-sized problem, or a little problem. I'm not satisfied with the explanations that it's a big problem. I honestly don't know.
Because, McIntyre says, he continued to find sloppy errors and serious mistakes by a number of the world's most prominent global warming researchers. For instance, in 2007, NASA issued a report that claimed 1998 was the warmest year recorded in the continental United States. McIntyre, however, exposed a technical mistake that forced NASA to issue a correction that 1934 was the warmest. And just last September, McIntyre identified another major flaw by another renowned climate scientist who used tree ring analysis.
They used a sample that was too small.
Too small for the method they were using.
That researcher called McIntyre's work demonstrably biased, a sentiment, as you will see, still shared by the global warming research community. But as it turns out, those scientists would have a lot more explaining to do when the world learned what they were saying to one another about the science underlying their dire warnings.
Breaking down the ClimateGate scandal when we return.